So among experienced gardeners, there's often a debate about whether or not to prune your tomato plants. We personally don't prune our tomato plants for a variety of reasons that I'll get into at the end of this segment. But for now, today we are in the garden of our friend and fellow master gardener, Bob Labozetta. Bob is a firm proponent of pruning your tomatoes, and he's going to take a few minutes to show you how to prune tomatoes and tell you the reasons why he thinks it's important to do so.
Again, as Helen pointed out, my name is Bob Labozetta. You may recognize the name as a regular contributor to the Over the Garden Fence articles in the Gazette and other online media. Anyway, I'm here to be part of the presentation on the pruning concept. Well, why prune? Why not prune? So as Helen pointed out, I'm an avid proponent of pruning for several reasons. One is, if you don't prune, you normally have to space your tomato plants 2 to 3 feet apart. In that space, I can put up to 3 tomatoes. So I really enjoy growing multiple different types of tomatoes and seeing how they're doing. So that 1 foot on center that I tend to plant my tomatoes, intending to prune them, is a real plus. Another reason to prune is that you're able to grow larger tomatoes, especially earlier in the season. Over the course of the season, the number of tomatoes would be less than with pruning, but pruning allows you to grow a little fewer but larger tomatoes, and weight size you actually outproduce many plants that are unpruned. Another question to consider is, what type of tomatoes do you have? If you have determinate tomatoes, then you should not prune, because all the tomatoes come ripe at one particular time. You don't want to sacrifice the tomatoes. So I would not suggest pruning determinate tomatoes. Indeterminate tomatoes, however, produce and ripen over the course of the season. And pruning can be a great boon to that, as I pointed out, allowing closer spacing. You can plant more tomatoes, different types of tomatoes, and the tomato size themselves is usually larger, especially earlier in the season. Another advantage of pruning is you have more control over the growth pattern of the tomato, and instead of allowing them to sprawl all over the place, you can train them up, and usually they grow in a more vertical, narrower band than a spread out, even caged, unpruned tomato. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of indicate which parts of the tomato plant you should prune, and then just kind of go from there. What you want to prune from an indeterminate tomato plant are what are known as suckers. And suckers are the small part of a plant that comes out at the axil between a leaf and a stem. So as we can see down here, this is a small sucker that should be pruned. And when it's this size, 2 inches, about 2 inches or less, you can prune merely by pinching it off. There we go. So there's the sucker that I pruned off. I just tossed it in the soil, and now there will be nothing growing up here. You also want to prune generally to at most 2 main stems per plant. I usually do 1 for a while, and then as it grows and it gets bigger, I will leave the plant unpruned to provide shade from the heat of the sun, especially late during the summer. Because one of the disadvantages of pruning is you do get rid of the leaves that are providing shade to prevent sun scald. Well, in pruned plants you have less of that foliage. And of course, the counter argument to that is one of the advantages of pruning is that more energy goes into the production of tomatoes than goes into the production of foliage. And that's just energy sucking. So if you really want to grow great looking tomatoes, then pruning is one way of doing that. One of the advantages of pruning is you can take those suckers and you can root them. In my case, I just rooted them in potting soil. Just made sure that it stayed very damp, and they will grow roots all along the stem. So the deeper you can plant it in, like a solo cup, the better root system you'll get. all these plants here that you see, these are all from earlier prunings, earlier in the season. So I merely clipped a sucker off of one of the first tomato plants, or several of the first tomato plants that I planted this season, rooted them in potting soil, and once the roots developed, then stuck them in the ground, and you get a nice later season harvest of tomatoes. Because these are indeterminate tomatoes, they're going to grow and just get taller and taller throughout the season. So at some point, to keep it within human reaching range, you want to top off your plants, and then that may produce some more side suckers later on that you might want to let go, or you may want to prune also. But that's another technique for late in the season, as the tomato plants just get kind of out of control. Smaller suckers of 2 inches or less can be easily pinched off with your thumb and fingernails. But the larger ones, you'll want to use a clipper so that you don't leave a jagged edge and an open wound on the tomatoes. At least try to reduce that as much as possible. So I'm going to show a larger stem that can easily be pruned using just garden pruners. So this is an example of a larger sucker that for some reason I just let grow. It's already got 2 main stems here growing on this tomato plant, so I'll just easily clip it close to the stem and leaf, and you can either take it out, compost or whatever. I just leave it on the soil, adds a little humus later on. If you're going to prune your indeterminate tomato plants, I suggest you prune the lower portion at the very beginning and continue to prune up to no more than the first cluster of blossoms. What that does is help create a stronger stem. If you let the suckers go at the bottom of the plant, the stem tends to be a little weakened. So prune it off up to no more than the first cluster of blossoms, and then after that it's just pruning to keep the tomato plant in shape. Allow it to go and create shade for later in the season to help protect the tomato plants from sun scald. But early in the season especially, pruning is quite a benefit for the plant. Again, you'll get heavier, bigger tomatoes, though fewer in number, and the energy of the plant will go towards producing those tomatoes rather than just creating foliage, which is just superfluous.
So we're back in our garden, and as you can see, we don't prune our tomato plants. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Part of it's personal preference, part of it is the climate that we live in, and honestly, part of it's just plain laziness. So back in the day when I thought I really should be pruning the tomato plants, I honestly just never got around to it and had perfect success without pruning. I also never really bought into the idea that we really needed to do it where we live for certain circumstances that we experience here. And the personal preference is, I really don't care about having mammoth-sized tomatoes. Most of our tomatoes are either cut up and put in salads or pureed for future use in sauces and soups. And on the rare occasion that we want to have a slicing tomato for a sandwich or a hamburger, we usually have 1 or 2 varieties that by their nature are just larger tomatoes. So for instance, the hybrid Celebrity or the heirloom Brandywine, both of which are fairly large. Not as large as Bob tomatoes, but they do the job. And yes, as you can see, our tomato plants are fairly out of control. If you're someone that is supporting your tomatoes just using stakes or one of these traditional metal cone-shaped supports that you can get at your local hardware store or a nursery, you really do need to be pruning, because these are not built to support a full-grown indeterminate tomato. They get really heavy. And so what we've done over the years that's worked very successfully is to use livestock fencing. And so we'll cut the fencing into the length of our bed, and we'll use 2 of them, and we'll wire them across the top and then spread out the bottom of them and stake them to the soil so that we have a kind of teepee. And this has been good enough to support the weight of the very large tomato plants that we have. The one thing that we do is try to prune up the plants about 4 inches above the soil, because you really don't want the soil to touch the leaves, because that's a pathway for soil pathogens to get into your tomato plant and sicken them and often kill them. So another thing to consider that doesn't affect us is some of our friends live at higher elevations here in the foothills, and so they get occasional precipitation in the form of thunderstorms, and that can really increase the humidity, and humidity is a very bad thing for tomatoes. So you'll find in those conditions that you'll get powdery mildew, and there's all kinds of other really bad fungal diseases that can hurt your plants. So if you prune them pretty aggressively, like Bob does, then you'll get better airflow, and that reduces a lot of those fungal problems. In our case, down here at 2,100 feet, we rarely get a drop of rain during the summer, so we don't feel the need to prune because of those reasons. This year, not only did we choose not to prune, but we intentionally planted the plants much closer together. So in this particular 10 by 4 foot bed, we have 12 plants. And we did this because it was an experiment to see if we could increase the density of the foliage to not only protect against sun scald, but also to keep the soil a lot cooler and the plants themselves a lot cooler, in an effort to reduce some of the disorders that happen because of the heat that we get here. And so far we have had some success. We've had absolutely no sun scald. We've had great production, and we have had no blossom drop or failure to set fruit. We do still, however, have cracking and blossom end rot in the varieties that are more prone to that problem. So the one downside that I can see to not pruning in our particular conditions is trying to find the tomatoes, because they're buried way in there in the foliage, and sometimes you don't see them in there, and so you really have to dig around and fight with the plants to get at your fruit. So in conclusion, there's really no right or wrong way to do it. It just really depends on your personal preferences and the conditions in which your tomatoes are growing.